I didn't marry him because I loved him. I married him because I was about to lose everything. My father was dead. My home was days from foreclosure. And then a stranger walked into my life with a contract instead of comfort. 6 months of marriage. No feelings. No touching. No mistakes. He said it was simple. What he didn't tell me was that this marriage wasn't meant to save me. It was meant to control me. And the moment I signed that contract, I stepped into a world where love was dangerous. Silence was a weapon. And walking away was no longer an option. Cold rain poured from the gray sky, blurring the world into streaks of silver and shadow. Elena Moore stood motionless beside the fresh grave, her fingers clenched tightly around the handle of a borrowed black umbrella. The funeral had ended minutes ago, yet she hadn't moved. The scent of wet soil and wilting lilies hung heavy in the air, clinging to her clothes, seeping into her lungs. Her father was gone. There were no comforting words left to hear, no arms left to lean into. When the final mourners drifted away, Elena remained alone, staring at the mound of earth that marked the end of everything familiar. That afternoon, the second blow came. In the dim, dust-filled office of the family attorney, Elena sat stiffly as the man across from her folded his hands, his expression heavy with reluctant pity. "I wish there were another way to say this," he began carefully. "But your father left behind significant debt. Medical expenses. Business loans that never recovered." Elena's heart sank before he even finished. "The bank has already initiated foreclosure proceedings," he continued. "You have 30 days. 30 days. The house, the only home she had ever known, the place where her mother's laughter still echoed in the hallways, where her father's books still lined the shelves, would be taken from her. She walked out of the office in a daze, her grief transforming into a suffocating panic. She was mourning, broke, and on the edge of losing everything. 2 days later, a knock sounded at her door. Elena opened it to find a man who looked like he belonged to a completely different universe. He was tall, immaculately dressed, his tailored charcoal suit sharp enough to feel like armor. His expression was calm, unreadable, the kind of face that never asked for permission. She recognized him instantly. Nathan Blackwell. The most feared corporate attorney in the city. CEO of Blackwell and Company. A man rumored to win cases before they even reached court. He didn't offer condolences. He didn't soften his presence. "Ms. Moore," he said evenly. "I understand you're in a difficult position." Her fingers tightened around the doorframe. "If you're here to sell legal services, I can't afford you." A faint flicker of calculation passed through his eyes. "I'm not here to offer my services," he replied. "I'm here to make you an offer." Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside, his gaze briefly sweeping over the half-packed boxes and dim rooms. "I will pay off every cent of your father's debt," he said. "Immediately. The house will remain yours." The words hit her like a sudden flash of light in complete darkness. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite herself. He turned fully toward her then, his gaze cold, unwavering. "In return," he said quietly, "you will marry me." The room seemed to tilt. Elena stared at him, convinced she had misheard. "Excuse me?" "This will be a legal marriage," Nathan continued, as if discussing a business merger. 6 months in duration. Her pulse thundered in her ears. "Why me?" "That is not relevant," he replied. "But there is one condition." She crossed her arms, bracing herself. "What condition?" His voice dropped, measured and lethal in its calm. "There will be no emotional attachment. No romance. No intimacy." He stepped closer, the faint scent of cedar and cold air surrounding him. "In public, we appear united. In private, we live entirely separate lives. If you violate this rule, even once, the agreement ends. The debt returns. The house is forfeited." It was cruel. Inhuman. A marriage stripped of everything that made it human. Elena felt anger rise, then fear, then resignation. She saw her father's smile. The home he loved. The life she stood to lose. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks as she whispered, "I accept." Nathan gave a single nod, emotionless. "I'll have my driver collect you tomorrow morning. 9 sharp." He placed a leather-bound folder on the table and walked out, leaving her alone with the contract that had just sold 6 months of her life. The next morning, a black sedan waited outside Elena's house at exactly 9 o'clock. Not 9:01. Not 9:05. The driver stepped out first, opening the door with practiced precision. No smile. No small talk. Just efficiency. Elena took one last look at the house before stepping inside the car. The familiar porch. The cracked steps. The window where her mother used to sit in the afternoons. She told herself it was only 6 months. The city disappeared behind tinted glass as they drove toward Blackwell Tower, a steel and glass monument that pierced the skyline like a declaration of power. Nathan was already waiting. So were the lawyers. The ceremony took less than 15 minutes. No guests. No vows spoken aloud. No witnesses who cared. Elena signed her name with a hand that barely felt like her own. When she finished, Nathan added his signature without hesitation, as if closing another corporate deal. "Congratulations," one of the attorneys said politely. The word felt hollow. By afternoon, she was installed in a penthouse overlooking the river. Everything smelled new. Untouched. Expensive enough to make her afraid to breathe too hard. Nathan stood near the window, his back to her. "There are rules," he said, without turning. "You've heard the condition, but I'll repeat it." She nodded. "We attend events together. We live under the same roof. But there will be no emotional entanglement. No physical relationship." He turned then, his eyes sharp. "Especially no feelings." Elena swallowed. "And if I break the rule?" "You won't," he said flatly. That night, they ate dinner in silence at opposite ends of the table. The space between them felt deliberate, measured. Afterward, he gestured toward the hallway. "Your room is on the left. Mine is on the right." No explanation. No hesitation. When Elena closed the door behind her, the silence pressed in hard. The room was larger than her entire apartment back home, yet she had never felt smaller. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying his words. No feelings. As if emotions were switches that could simply be turned off, she told herself she could do this. 6 months. No attachment. No mistakes. But as she drifted into uneasy sleep, one thought refused to leave her mind. Rules were easy to set. They were much harder to survive. The first public appearance came sooner than Elena expected. 3 days after the wedding, a charity gala invitation arrived, embossed, formal, impossible to refuse. "We'll attend together," Nathan said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Say as little as possible. Let me handle the conversations." Elena nodded, her stomach tightening. By the time she stood in front of the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The gown was elegant but restrained, designed to signal wealth without warmth. Her hair was styled perfectly. Her expression practiced. She looked like someone who belonged. The ballroom glittered with crystal lights and quiet judgment. The moment they entered, conversations paused, just long enough to be noticed. Elena felt it immediately, the slow, deliberate scrutiny. People smiled, but their eyes calculated. They weren't curious. They were measuring. A woman with pearls approached first, her voice honeyed. "So this is Nathan's wife. How sudden." "Yes," Elena replied calmly. "Life moves quickly sometimes." The woman's smile stiffened. Another man leaned in during dinner. "What do you do, my dear?" Elena met his gaze. "I observe." He laughed, unsure if it was a joke. Across the room, Elena noticed the way whispers followed Nathan. How names and alliances shifted subtly around him. This wasn't socializing. It was strategy. Later, when a guest joked loudly about marriages of convenience, Elena felt Nathan's hand close briefly around hers. "There's nothing convenient about commitment," he said coolly. Silence followed. On the drive home, Elena exhaled shakily. "Do they all hate me?" "They don't know you," Nathan replied. "Which is worse?" She glanced at him. "And you? Do you know me?" For the first time, he hesitated. "Enough," he said. That night, Elena lay awake, replaying every glance, every comment. The truth settled uncomfortably in her chest. This marriage wasn't invisible. It was a spotlight, and standing beside Nathan Blackwell meant being seen, whether she was ready or not. The first call came late at night. Elena was still awake, sitting by the window of her room, when her phone vibrated softly against the glass. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Almost. "Mrs. Blackwell," a male voice said smoothly the moment she answered. "Congratulations on your recent marriage." Her grip tightened. "Who is this?" "A friend," he replied. "Or perhaps, someone who prefers not to be an enemy." The line went dead before she could respond. The next day, the looks at Blackwell Tower changed. They were no longer curious. They were alert. Elena noticed the way assistants paused when she walked past, how conversations stopped just a beat too late. Someone had talked. Someone always did. At lunch, a woman she didn't recognize slid into the chair across from her. "You married well," she said lightly. "But men like Nathan don't marry without reason." Elena forced a polite smile. "Neither do women." The woman laughed softly. "Careful. People might start thinking you're more involved than you are." That evening, Elena told Nathan about the call. His expression darkened instantly. "They shouldn't be contacting you," he said. "But they are," she replied. "And they think I matter." Silence stretched between them. "That makes you vulnerable," he finally said. "And useful," Elena countered. He looked at her sharply. "You said there would be no surprises," she continued. "Yet people are reaching out to me like I'm part of your negotiations." Nathan exhaled slowly. "The condition still stands." "No feelings," she said quietly. "But what about trust?" He didn't answer. That night, Elena lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The rule that was supposed to protect her was doing the opposite. It wasn't keeping distance. It was isolating her. And for the first time, Elena wondered whether the most dangerous part of this marriage wasn't the lack of love, but the silence between them. The warning didn't come again by phone. It came in writing. A thin envelope appeared on Elena's desk one morning, placed there without explanation. No stamp. No return address. Just her name written neatly on the front. Inside was a single page. "You don't know what you married into. Walk away while you still can." Her pulse quickened. That afternoon, as she left the building, a black car pulled alongside her on the curb. The window lowered just enough for a voice to carry. "Mrs. Blackwell," the man said calmly. "You seem intelligent. Intelligent women know when to step aside." Elena didn't respond. She kept walking. But her hands trembled until she reached the safety of the car waiting for her. That night, she confronted Nathan. "This isn't coincidence," she said, placing the letter on the table between them. "Someone is trying to scare me out of this marriage." Nathan's jaw tightened as he read. "They're testing you," he said finally, "or threatening me," Elena replied. "There's a difference." He met her gaze. "If you want out, say it now." The offer was real. She could hear it in his voice. For a long moment, Elena considered it. 6 months. A house saved. A life paid for. She could leave and never look back, but she thought of the way people spoke around her, not to her. The way they assumed fear would be enough. No, she said quietly. I won't run. Nathan studied her, something unreadable passing through his eyes. Then you need to understand something, he said. This isn't about marriage. It's about leverage. And I'm the leverage, Elena said. Yes, he admitted. The honesty stung, but it also clarified everything. Then stop pretending I'm just your wife, Elena said. If I'm in this, I need to know the rules of the game. Nathan paused, then nodded once. Very well, he said. But once you see the full picture, there's no pretending anymore. Elena straightened her shoulders. She had already stepped into the fire. Now, she intended to learn how to stand there. Nathan didn't shield me after that conversation. He did something far more dangerous. He informed me. Late one evening, he brought a thin folder into the living room and placed it on the table between us. These are the people who contacted you, he said. Directly or indirectly. I opened it slowly. Names. Positions. Connections that overlapped in places I didn't yet understand. They think you're fragile, Nathan continued. Temporary. Something they can pressure out of place. Elena closed the folder. Then they're wrong. The first chance to prove it came sooner than expected. At a closed-door legal conference, Nathan's name appeared on the speaker list. So did mine. The invitation wasn't accidental. When we arrived, conversations paused again, but this time, they didn't resume. Elena felt it, surprise, then calculation. A man approached her during the reception. I didn't realize you were involved. I wasn't, she replied calmly. I am now. His smile faltered. Later, during a discussion about regulatory oversight, Elena spoke not loudly. Not emotionally. Just clearly. She asked one question. And the room shifted. It was the kind of question people avoided because it made things visible. Afterward, messages flooded Nathan's phone. Not threats. Requests. When they returned home that night, Nathan looked at her with something new in his expression. You understand leverage instinctively, he said. I understand people, Elena replied. And fear. She paused, then added, if you want me silent, say so now. I don't, he answered immediately. I want you prepared. The weight of that settled between them. This was no longer protection. It was partnership. And for the first time since signing that contract, Elena didn't feel like she was surviving the arrangement. She was shaping it. The shift wasn't loud. It never is. Suddenly, people started asking for my opinion instead of ignoring my presence. Meetings included my name. Emails copied me deliberately. I wasn't announced. I was acknowledged. One afternoon, while reviewing documents in Nathan's study, I noticed something he had missed. This clause, I said, tapping the page, it protects them, not you. Nathan leaned closer. They told me it was standard. That's why it's dangerous, I replied. Standard for people who don't plan to be challenged. He studied the document again, slower this time. You just saved me 6 months of litigation, he said. I grew up watching contracts ruin lives, Elena answered quietly. I read the parts everyone else schemes. From that day on, things changed. Invitations came addressed to both of us. Questions were directed at me, not around me. And the people who once tried to intimidate me now chose their words carefully, but something else changed too. Nathan stopped keeping his distance. Not physically, he still respected the rule. But his silences became conversations. His glances lingered longer than before. One evening, as we reviewed strategy late into the night, he paused. You're not supposed to care about this, he said. I know, Elena replied. And yet you do. Yes. The admission hung between them, dangerous and honest. This complicates things, he said. I was never simple, she answered. For the first time, Nathan smiled, not the controlled version he wore in public, but something real. Brief. Gone too quickly, the rule still existed. But now, it felt fragile. And fragility, Elena realized, was the beginning of choice. The exposure came quietly at first. An article. Then another. Nothing defamatory. Nothing that could be sued, just questions. Why had Nathan Blackwell's wife appeared so suddenly in strategic meetings? Was she merely symbolic, or something more? Elena felt it immediately at the next public forum. Eyes followed her. Not dismissive anymore. Careful. A senior partner approached her during the intermission, voice low. You should consider stepping back. This level of visibility invites consequences. Elena met his gaze. So does hiding. That evening, the call came. This time, there was no pretense. You're becoming a liability, the voice said flatly. Walk away, or things will get uncomfortable. When she hung up, her hands were steady. She found Nathan in the study, reviewing reports. They're escalating, she said. Not because I'm weak, but because I'm not. He closed the file slowly. I can end this. Publicly. Now. And confirm everything they suspect? Elena asked. That I was only ever temporary? He looked at her then, not as a strategist, not as a protector. As a man weighing loss. This was never supposed to cost you, he said. It already did, she replied. What matters is whether it costs me myself. The silence stretched. Then Elena took a breath. I won't disappear, she said. And I won't pretend I don't matter just to make this easier. Nathan nodded once, decisively. Then we stop managing perception, he said. We tell the truth. The next day, they arrived together at a closed-door summit, unannounced, unshielded. When questions came, Elena answered them. Not defensively. Not aggressively. Honestly. The room didn't explode. It recalibrated. And in that moment, Elena understood something profound. Power didn't belong to the loudest voice. It belonged to the one who refused to retreat. The fallout didn't happen overnight. It unfolded in silence. Deals were delayed. Alliances quietly dissolved. People who once spoke with certainty suddenly hesitated, fear had shifted direction. With the pressure gone, something else surfaced in space. One evening, as the city lights flickered below the penthouse windows, Nathan stood beside Elena, hands resting in his pockets. This ends here, he said. The contract. The performance. All of it. Elena turned to him. And what happens after? That depends on you. For the first time since the night he knocked on her door, there was no strategy in his voice. Only honesty. I asked you to marry me to protect my position, he continued. But somewhere along the way, you became the reason it changed. Elena felt the weight of his words, but she didn't let them decide for her. I didn't survive all of this to be absorbed into someone else's life, she said quietly. I needed to know I could stand on my own. He nodded. Then stand. They ended the marriage without spectacle. No scandal. No headlines. Just 2 signatures and mutual respect. Months later, Elena's life looked nothing like the one she'd entered. She rebuilt the house she almost lost. Started something of her own, small, deliberate, unowned. Sometimes she saw Nathan's name in the news. Sometimes she didn't. But when she thought of him, it wasn't with regret. It was with clarity. Because she hadn't been rescued, she had chosen herself. And once you learn how power truly works, no one ever gets to decide your worth for you again.